Yes, I founded the 451 Institute a couple of months ago. It's a social cohesion foundation, nurturing disagreement so that we can have really good conversation where we disagree because it's productive. We need to protect democratic institutions so that the disagreement doesn't escalate into a conflict, so that they can be more resilient to potential conflicts.
As if an institution does not want to nurture that sort of approach or culture?
Well, we know exactly what happens then, because pre-Enlightenment, what you had is a culture of dogma. If you make an error in a system of dogma, you will never get out of it. And so the Enlightenment brought us the ability by which we can disagree so that we engage in progress after a while. Now, what we're seeing today, indeed, is a form of ideological capture. What I'm interested in is not, left or right. It's about the system itself. What they're trying to do is to impose a certain worldview and exclude others from the conversations. Looking at the precipice now, because you see an erosion of the rule of law virtually everywhere because of the issues of the day. You have an issue today, you want to resolve it, and you are bending the rules so much that you are taking a risk with the rule itself. The way that I founded the 451 Institute was always to be politics-agnostics. And that includes not taking a view on conservatism or progressivism. You want to protect your core mission, so you need to define it, and you need to contain the potential breaches of that core mission. But this legitimate system cannot be just majority-based. If it is only majority-based, you have a very big vulnerability. Red teaming is basically setting up a team that pokes holes into your plans. So when I think about democratic resilience, what I believe I need to do is to stress test it. I want to be able to say, if I wanted to destroy democracy, what would be the best way to do that? And then move away from there. I want to develop a resilience to politicization barometer, something that would be able to measure whether an institution is more or less likely to be captured ideologically, whatever the ideology.
Hi, and welcome to the next edition of Beyond the Bubble. As always, we'd be extremely grateful if you put a like on the show, you subscribe to it, you turn on the little notification bell so you are alerted when we release a new episode. Also, follow us on LinkedIn on the Beyond the Bubble channel or Beyond the Bubble page, as well as on Spotify. So with that, today's guest is Yohan Benizri, who is a Belgian trade lawyer who recently founded the 451 Institute, which focuses on viewpoint diversity, institutional neutrality, and ideological capture. And these are very sensitive and important topics, and he brings a very nuanced point about all of these. Enjoy the conversation. Hi, Yohan.
Hi.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for welcoming me.
Yes, it's really good to have you here because you are not only a Belgian who was born in Belgium and not an acquired citizenship like so many of us. You're a lawyer, a trade lawyer, but way beyond that, you are a thinker and someone who just I say, a couple of months ago started and growing a very interesting initiative, which you will say how you actually define it, because it's not exactly a think tank, it's somewhat beyond it, called the 451 Institute. And all around it, what wraps these two hats of yours is your analytical mind and your interest in better ways of thinking. And I think, as we spoke off camera before, you have a lot of thoughts and approaches about AI, and not so much as a technical tool, but as a thinking tool. So I think this is the kind of red thread that connects these topics, and I'd love to hear how you put this together in your mind.
It's very impressive that you could summarize me so well in just a couple of minutes that we spoke off camera. Yes, I founded the 451 Institute a couple of months ago. It's taking a lot of my time. The way that I put it is that it's a social cohesion foundation, aiming at nurturing disagreement so that we can have really good conversation where we disagree because it's productive, but preempting conflict. That is, we need to protect democratic institutions so that the disagreement doesn't escalate into a conflict. And it is in the form of a think tank because ultimately what we produce is research and we provide services to institutions so that they can be more resilient to potential conflicts. But I'm happy to talk about any of those topics with you. I really enjoyed our previous conversation.
Yeah, so I want to pick up on that and maybe immediately go all in and ask the question, what happens if an institution does not want to nurture that sort of approach or culture? Because as we've seen, and we can talk about political institutions, but academic institutions and all sorts of scientific institutions and all the rest, where they often become immersed in a certain mindset or in a certain ideological capture, which we're witnessing increasingly, or media for that matter. And they actually don't have the desire to bring you in or bring someone with that sort of perspective, who want to nurture the disagreement without conflict, because they're very happy and okay with the groupthink.
Yes, well, we know exactly what happens then, because pre-Enlightenment, what you had is the church was dominating everything. It wanted to give you answers to every single question. And if you disagreed with the answers, you were in very big trouble. You could be put to death. And that was a culture of dogma, right? Now, what happens then is that you're making yourself liable to staying mistaken. If you make an error in a system of dogma, you will never get out of it. And so the Enlightenment brought us the ability that is unnatural to a certain extent, not to impose our worldviews on others, but to have a system by which we can disagree so that we engage in progress after a while. And this process of making mistakes, but being through free speech, essentially, being able to correct those mistakes over time is what allowed us to make enormous progress. Now, what we're seeing today, indeed, is a form of ideological capture. And we need to be careful with words because sometimes they're associated with certain worldviews. What I'm interested in is not, left or right. It's about the system itself. If you have for example, top-down pressure on universities in the US from the right today, but you have left bottom-up type of pressure from in the universities as well. You have the same type of issue, of systematic issue. You don't have the same issue. You don't have the same worldview, but you have the same mechanics. What they're trying to do is to impose a certain worldview and exclude others from the conversations. And what you get then is that the core mission of the institution, which is for universities truth-seeking, right, is disrupted. The disruption of a core mission is what I'm most interested in. You can have that in academia, where if you have an agenda that you want to pursue, for example, far-right policies or far-left policies in the humanities, you could do that, and then it's going to make the institution incapable of fulfilling its core mission of truth-seeking because you will never be able to correct any errors. But the same is true in other institutions. In media, for example, if you have a completely homogeneous group controlling media narratives, you will never be able to be well informed. And the core mission of media is to inform you. Of course, as long as there's a lot of competition, it works. But the moment where you have a spiral of a dogma that takes hold, it's going to be very difficult to get out of it.
Let me jump into a keyword that you mentioned there is what is the core mission? Because that's where I feel that the times have changed, or let's say the core mission has changed over time in the past couple of years, maybe a decade or so. It's not necessarily truth-seeking anymore, even at universities, which is what the core mission since the early, 13th century or whenever the first university was founded has been. Same for media. Is the media's core mission really the truth-seeking, or is it something very different because there are financial incentives, there is catering to tribalism and all the rest? So are you still of the view that these core missions are there, or that foundational idea has been redefined as well?
You're absolutely right. In fact, I just had a conversation with one of the members of our board of advisors, Steven Pinker, and he was saying exactly
the Harvard psychologist.
Correct, and he was saying exactly the same thing as you just did. He said it's not clear that we all share the understanding that the core mission of university is knowledge production and dissemination and truth seeking. For some people, and we need to be charitable with their views as well, it is social justice, not truth. And the mission of the university should be social justice. The problem with this, and it's something that I keep on repeating to everyone, is that the social justice that you define is not the same one that I define. And so if you have an objective of social justice, you will impose a worldview. The problem with this is that now you may be in power and you may want to impose one particular worldview, but tomorrow you don't know what the majority will be. So you want to protect the institution's core mission and to make the core mission something that cannot be hijacked based on a certain worldview. Whether I agree with you or not, it's more important that there's a level of the possibility for change than it is to define what is happening today. The same is true in politics, by the way. You have countries where there are no limits to the number of mandates that you can have as the leader of the country. That's a huge problem. It's more important than...
I mean, how many times a person can be reelected?
Exactly. So, term limits are great, but if you can have indefinite repetitions of those term limits, you have a huge problem of the possibility of ideological capture of an entire country. So that's the kind of thing that I'm interested in, is how to make sure that the architecture of the system is resilient.
Let me just quickly jump back to your other hat, being a lawyer, and you're a trade lawyer as your core expertise, but it's rather constitutional law, where the Constitution, by the very definition of the word, how a country or what has constituted the value set of a country and the operating system of a country is what defines those limits. And that's why if a constitution is rewritten or reinterpreted through constitutional courts, that's what really can push or challenge this underlying system. So do you see that as the ultimate safeguard of these of systems? So
that's the problem that we have in legal circles. You're right. What we thought was we have good constitutions, we have international treaties, and we have independent courts. With that, any situation that is happening right now can be remedied because we believe in individual rights, because we have human rights.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with this worldview is that I think we went to the end of that thinking thinking process, because today you could have...
Sorry to interrupt. End or edge?
maybe to the edge, right? We reached a system where you are looking at the precipice now. Why am I saying this? Because you see an erosion of the rule of law virtually everywhere, including in relatively democratic systems, because of the issues of the day. You have an issue today, you want to resolve it, and you are basically bending the rules so much that you are taking a risk with the rule itself. So when you're talking about constitutional principles, it's great that we have courts that would be able to remedy certain situations after the fact.
Yeah.
But we have two problems with that. One, the consequences of a majority decision can be incredibly severe before you can remedy it. That's a huge issue. For example, if you removed the right to having an abortion, or if you remove the right to vote for certain people, or if you removed certain protections for religious freedoms for certain people, that would have immediate severe effects, disruptions again. And the other problem that we have is that we don't know that the courts will actually reverse course. Why am I saying that? Because there are more and more research now showing that courts tend to ultimately uphold the majority view, even though there are certain principles. And you see that in many different aspects, including in EU law, by the way. You have seen what is called the Geopolitical Commission. And it's interesting to see that they're bending the rules as well. And they're relying, for example, it's technical, but they're relying on an article that is for financial emergencies between countries, which is called Article 122, to do all kind of things, to push for all kind of things that they cannot do because they don't have consensus. Now,
article in the treaty,
yes,
the EU treaty.
Yes. So, and what I'm concerned about, again, is not the push for a certain worldview with which I may or may not agree. The problem is that tomorrow, another majority could use the exact same tools to push a completely different agenda that would be terrible, and you would have no arguments to oppose it because they will say you just did the same.
So here comes the question, and to some degree, this is the textbook example, or struggle is perhaps a big word, but the textbook example of progressivism or progress versus conservatism, where conservative would say, well, we want to preserve a system that had its faults, but it's a framework in which the developments or societal advancement could happen, but we want to preserve a framework. Whereas a progressive view would be, we actually want to rewrite that framework because it hasn't led to a better society the way they want to decide that or define that. So do you question the underlying framework, or do you operate within the boundaries of that framework?
Well, it's a good question, but the way that I founded the 451 Institute was always to be politics-agnostics. And that includes not taking a view on conservatism or progressivism. The reason why I'm saying this is that I think we would lose sight too quickly of the goal of the 451 Institute if we thought in those terms. The term that I like to use is attack surface reduction. What you want is a system where you cannot attack it from too many angles. Whether you're from the left, or you're from the right, or you believe that you're center-right, it doesn't matter. What you want is a system that cannot be attacked from all sides. The system that has brought us the most benefits is the system that resulted from the Enlightenment. And so what I want is to protect that system. Attack surface reduction is actually coming from cybersecurity. The best way to explain it is that, if you have a very big castle and it has many, many doors, you can attack it from many angles. And so what you want is to have only a single door, and you also want containment. So that even if this door is broken somehow, it would only get you access to a certain area of the castle. And it's the same thing with computers. You don't want to open your ports to virtually everyone in the world, because then you can be attacked. The same system can be applied to institutions. You want to protect your core mission, so you need to define it, and you need to contain the potential breaches of that core mission, or the disruptions of that core mission. Same is true for political institutions. You want to have a legitimate system, but this legitimate system cannot be just majority-based. If it is only majority-based, you have a very big vulnerability. And I'm thinking about this both in the foundation and in my work. My work is basically red teaming, but in legal circles.
Okay, define that.
Well, red teaming is something that existed for a long time in the intelligence or military sectors, where you had a plan, and the plan was developed by very smart people, but they realized that in order to correct mistakes, and we are coming back to the start of our discussion, in order to correct mistakes, you need to have another team that is completely independent, that will show you the vulnerabilities of your plan, so that you can improve the plan, before it is implemented. So red teaming is basically setting up a team that pokes holes into your plans. So when I think about democratic resilience, what I believe I need to do is to stress test it. I want to be able to say, if I wanted to destroy democracy, what would be the best way to do that? And then move away from there. And the same is true when I advise clients. It's if I wanted them to lose, what would be the best way to present an argument so that they would lose? And that's what we're trying to do, to ensure the resilience of the system and to ensure that we correct our own mistakes.
My immediate take on this is we fell asleep at the wheel for so long. And I say we, as especially from a European perspective, and possibly other societies as well, often English-speaking societies, with a lot of naivety. And I would not go any further in speculating or entering the realm of the unknown, or to say, well, that there has been corruption in the system and deliberate ways of corrupting the systems. But to say have fallen asleep at the wheel in the sense of being too good faith and too much trusting that is the end of history, that no one's going to challenge democracies, that no one's going to find those vulnerabilities. Just very like an immediate example that comes to my mind is, you say, the Qatari funding of American universities and how much money they spend on lobbying Congress and through different organizations. And we don't even have those numbers in Europe, and presumably it could be as bad as on the other side of the Atlantic. And they are definitely not coming from a perspective that is amenable to our values and our way of life. So what I'm saying is that democracies, especially in so-called Western societies, be that all the way to Australia, have not realized, have not understood, let alone protected themselves against those surface exposure. And in democracies, there are just so many open doors, to use your metaphor. There is media channels and manipulating public opinion through think tanks, through civil society organizations, through universities. And again, this is not a claim that there aren't extremely valuable and ethical organizations of the sort, but we had all those exposures without truly working with the right resources, with the right protections, with the right defense mechanisms to keep the system that we hold dear.
I think that's a very valid observation, and a very acute one as well. Because what we are seeing is that it's probably just human nature, right? If you see a problem, if the worldview that you see in front of you is not the one that you believe in, you will be tempted to fight back very hard. But you will fight back to impose your worldview. You will not focus on the mechanism through which the worldview that you oppose is being imposed on you, right? So the problem, and I felt this from firsthand experience. I was the president of the Belgian Federation of Jewish Organizations at one point. I was involved in diplomacy for the Jewish people, also at the European and global level. And the thing is, when you're under attack, for example, on anti-Semitism or on religious freedom, you have to defend yourself. And so the way that you would naturally do that is try to convince the other person that your worldview is as valid and that they need to respect it. The problem with this is that you will never solve the problem. You will never solve the problem of, for example, anti-Semitism. That's impossible. There will always be people who hate other groups, and that's a problem. The solution that I believe in, and this is why I founded the 451 Institute, at least on that front, is that you need to protect the system. You need to protect the system so that those people who will have a different worldview than yours, and you need to be, except for hatred, you need to be charitable with many worldviews, those people will not ever be as powerful as to be able to crush you, as to be able to take away your civil liberties, as to be able to put you out of of certain geographical areas. That is what you want. You want to be to limit the worst outcomes. And I know it's not super sexy. People prefer to defend their own turf, but I believe it's more effective.
Would this not require, and it's a rhetorical question rather than a real one, would this not require at least some baseline agreement on certain shared values? And I could bring in Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations approach and principles, where everybody, he basically breaks it down that everyone has 6 foundational dichotomies or moral values. And if I don't share yours, that's okay. That's perfectly fine. But let's find a third one that we can both agree on. But what if one of my core motivators or drivers is that I do not want to grant you the liberty to be yourself, to express yourself, to have the same opportunities as others, to live in a colorblind and equal opportunity society? What happens then?
Yeah, that's a question that I struggled with for years, and I had to read a lot about, how do we come to a decision when you have very different worldviews? And one solution that we came up with is majority-based decisions. And we immediately realized that there was a problem with this because you could get to the tyranny of the majority. And so the idea is that you would want to find a system where there's not only majority-based decisions, but also alternating majorities. And so that's how we built democracy. But there's still a problem with this, which is that sometimes you don't have those alternating majorities on certain issues. Like, for example, you could have a majority that is enduring and that is based on hatred to a certain specific group. Yeah. And so you will never be able to correct that through majority-based decisions and through, maybe alternating majorities on global issues. There is a solution to this, I believe, and this is something that we will do at the 451 Institute as well, is to promote a way to decide together that is based not only on solving a dispute, but that is based also on the rights that are affected by your decision.
Okay, can you give an example?
Yes. The most basic example is that a majority should never be able to deprive an individual or a group of a civil or political right. To grant it, a majority should always be able to grant such a political or civil liberty. But if it is about removing it, it is imperative that we do not allow this, at least for those people that are already in existence. We may decide that a system needs to be changed, but it should be for future generations. Otherwise, you're making a huge conflict in the society, and you will create incentives for more polarization and even violence.
I wanted to pause for a second. You mentioned future generations. I was about to use that as an example. So suppose there's a political majority in Belgium or France or Poland or whatnot. They grant, and I say they, the representatives, they grant certain rights for the future generations and say, well, the generation after us needs to have a right to work. And then we will bring in AI and all the societal upheaval it's likely going to make. But you say, okay, they have a right to work. And maybe be that a future generation or be that an existing part of a population, racial, ethnic, or other group might get extra rights. And where I'm heading with this question is, what if there's a feeling, there's an impression that certain groups have extra rights. Certain groups are more privileged than other groups, and be that a future generation, which is somewhat hypothetical, and you can bring it to the present and say certain groups are perceived to have certain unfair extra rights. So not only extra rights, but it's perceived as unfair.
Yeah.
So that codes in conflict because of feeling of resentment or unfairness. So you say never take away rights once that's been granted, but what if those rights are privileged or at least perceived to be?
Well, first of all, I want to be clear that I'm talking about political and civil rights. Those are really basic rights, right? Religious freedom, free speech, a right to life, a right to privacy. I mean, these are things that should be valued in and of themselves. In fact, they are, but sometimes we lose sight of this. The problem that I should have been clearer, that it's not about conservatism. It's not about fixing a specific worldview today. It is about taking the time necessary so that you can digest a new change. Because if you're removing a right, not conferring, but removing a right, it's going to have dramatic consequences, and you are creating a conflict today. When you're talking about removing a right in a long time from now, it's much more acceptable. For example, you have people saying, we should absolutely prohibit smoking completely. I mean, people have the right to buy cigarettes today, but maybe it's not such a good idea. Now, if you decided to ban smoking completely, which may be a very valid worldview, there's going to be a lot of conflict today. But if you're saying, the people being born from 2026 onward will never be able to buy cigarettes, it's much more acceptable from a social cohesion perspective. And you're not creating a conflict today that will be so polarizing and lead to conflict and potential violence.
Let me just ask it as a side note, somewhat side note. Do you consider yourself more of a legal theorist in the sense of principles first and really looking at frameworks, or to say, let's be pragmatic, let's be practical? Because you might say from a rights perspective, everyone has the right to buy alcohol or buy smoke or find ways which give them pleasure that at the same time harms their health. Again, with all the caveats that apply. But then you say, well, from a pragmatic societal perspective, let's look at it how it could be worked. So even if I agree with certain principles, what's workable, what's feasible, what's practical?
The way that I look at it is what I know is what I am inspired by. I think it's a very weird mix, but I think I'm in a mix between Kantian ethics, which is looking at, okay, if I generalized this worldview, would it still work? Yeah. So is it okay to generalize this principle
in geographic terms, or
if everyone was doing it? Yeah.
Mm.
So stealing or lying, if everyone was doing it, would the society be better or worse? And then you have a framework, by generalizing a behavior that is quite powerful. But at the same time, I'm also mindful of the fact that you need to respect our human nature of being also attached to a group, a family. First the family, and then the group, and then the country, and then the continent, and so on. And so you need to be not only completely Kantian, because if you were completely Kantian, you would essentially decide that any behavior that even favors your brother is wrong, because if it cannot be generalized for all of humanity. But if you take into account this group perspective, you have a better outcome. Now, to respond directly to your question, I think the way that I look at things is, what are the consequences of doing certain things right now? It's not consequentialism in the sense of moral consequentialism, but it's perhaps social consequentialism. What are the outcomes on the groups, not only on my group, but on any group tomorrow, if I'm pushing too much on this issue?
I think that's a helpful approach. And probably there are edge cases, or there are scenarios under which it's very difficult to see which principle or which moral perspective should prevail. And that's why it comes back to, maybe the core question is, what do you want to optimize for? Because if you want to optimize for human flourishing, that's different. If you want to optimize for societal cohesion, that is still somewhat different. If you want to optimize for individual freedom, I would say by and large, perhaps the American approach would fit in that category. And again, by and large, and there are big exceptions to that, that's also different. So which one is the core, the North Star that you would have in front? And what I hear you say is probably live and let live on a societal level, with a core attention to individual freedoms.
Well, I have strong core views. So live and let live is probably not the way that I look at this myself. But what we do at the foundation is really social cohesion, so that, there's, social cohesion in and of itself may be good, but it's not very productive. Social cohesion so that we can correct our mistakes over time. It's calm enough so that we can correct our mistakes over time. Today, the lack of social cohesion, or tribalism, or identitarianism, this type of things will lead us to a world where we cannot correct our mistakes. And I think this is the worst possible world. So I'm very attached to the Enlightenment principles. I'm very attached to changing the world and looking at the world not as it is only, but also as it should be. So I'm going to defend in groups and in other fora a certain worldview, but I will never do that if I believe that pushing it in a certain way will disrupt social cohesion and expose my group or any group to a huge vulnerability.
And I'm just thinking, how do you know, perhaps that's not even the right way to put it, where is a point when the self-correction becomes continuous to the degree that you constantly revise what you've done, what you've achieved, let's say a way a society works, without ever saying, actually, we're in a pretty optimal place. And we are the social, let's say, indicators that would give us information that whether it's literacy rates, whether it's birth rates, whether it's low suicide rates, whether it's access to housing, all those indicators are in a fairly good place. Maybe it's utopia, maybe it's never there, but still asking yourself the question that do we constantly need to be in this everlasting revision and correction?
I think we do. I think we do.
Because you might overcorrect in some sense. So you could say that the levers or the different variables that make a society good, however you define it, it can get in a disbalance. So if I want to give you a silly example, let's say I use Play-Doh, okay, and I want to create a little figure of a dog, okay, and I say, and I get to a point where it pretty much looks like a dog to the best of my abilities, but I keep working on it, and I say, I take this a little bit away, a little bit there, and after 10 more minutes, it no longer looks like a dog. It looks like nothing. I totally ruined at a point where it was fairly good. It was never perfect, but it was good enough. Now, again, in societal terms, this may be a silly analogy because there are just so many variables. But don't you want to pause at some point and say, this is fairly good? Where is that perpetuum mobile headed?
I think it's a great analogy. My point would be, do not change the composition of the Play-Doh. The idea is that if you break it, you can redo it. But if you change the chemical composition, you might never be able to do anything that looks like anything. And so I think we need to keep on correcting. Sometimes we will make mistakes. Sometimes we will go back and possibly reverse a situation that was good. In fact, to a certain extent, that's exactly what we did. We had 200 years of amazing progress, incredible progress. And to a certain extent, we were progressing towards more social cohesion. But we have seen that broken to a very large extent in the last few decades. And that, I believe, is the result of us trying to say, we have now the solution. And we need to move away from that. I think it's too dangerous because that is changing the chemical composition that allowed us to get to this point.
I think the ultimate difficulty, one huge difficulty is a perspective, because when you're in it, you don't necessarily have the view or the perspective to say, well, actually, it's pretty good. And then again, there is a hindsight bias and lots of other cognitive distortions when you say, we had it so good in the 90s. But perhaps if you ask someone in the 90s, they said, well, this is the worst of all the worlds, right? So it's very hard to get that orientation while you're in it or looking back. But also the other point I was going to make, sticking with the Play-Doh example that you say it's not that far off. When I changed that figure or the shape, or where is the point where I'm already tinkering with the material itself, right? Where is that line where I'm only shaping it while keeping its core composition, or where is a point where I'm already corrupting, destroying, changing the very fabric of it?
Well, again, it's not a bad example because you were trying to define a certain worldview. You wanted a dog. And in so doing, you have potentially taken away some of the Play-Doh and thrown it out. That's a very bad decision to make because what you want is the entire array of tools, and you want to avoid the worst possible outcomes. So if you threw out too much of your material, and now you can only do a dog or a cat, and that's the only two things that you can do, you have restricted yourself. in correcting mistakes for the future, because tomorrow you might be wanting to do
And
something
just to bring
completely
home
different.
that analogy, if you shut down media outlets by force from above and by the power that you have as a majority, or you exclude certain segments of society from being able to vote, or maybe not in legal sense, but in practical sense, that their access to the voting booths is not granted. So that's where this would be, where you throw out those elements, and it's very hard to get them back afterwards.
And sometimes it comes from a good place. For example, there's the Arcom in France. They want to have more media pluralism. This is good. Yeah, they are trying to uphold the idea that you need to have pluralistic views in media, and particularly on TV. The problem is that now they're pressured to adopt certain codes so that they can decide what is a nuanced view. Yeah. So basically, in the past, what we did was, you have 1 hour if you're from the right, and so I should have 1 hour from the left, and that's how we quantified it. Yeah. In France, that's how they quantified it. Before elections, it should be an equal spread of views that are voiced, because otherwise it skews the elections in one way or another. But then CNews, for example, decided that they would put the right-wing views during the day and the left-wing views during the night when nobody's watching. So, of course, people had trouble with that because it's not very pluralistic. I understand that. But now, a group of people, the Reporters Sans Frontières, they want to basically impose that Arcom takes a view on whether a specific tone of voice, a specific way of presenting things was pluralistic enough. And so it comes from a good place. They want to protect pluralism in media, but they're doing it in a way that is trying to oppose what they perceive as right-wing media. And they're doing it with a tool that tomorrow will be used against them. It's not only when you're pursuing a very negative agenda that you can break the fabric that you're dealing with. And that's what I'm interested in.
What sort of system are you constructing to create a workable framework and something that has the safeguards against that sort of corruption? I use again the word corruption, but again, not necessarily in a systemic sense or in an ethical sense, not as a financial corruption.
Well, the first thing is you need to, again, reduce the attack surface. So you want to focus first on what is it that we're trying to protect, and let's define that very well. And then the second step is inversion. So you think it's basically stress testing, right? You're inverting the problem so that you know what would bring about the outcomes that you don't want from an architectural perspective, not from a worldview perspective, from an architectural perspective. Is it resilient or not? And so you want to create a system where you can defend the core and you have thought of the possible consequences of a completely different worldview being used to attack the core. So that's the way that I approach things.
And in your institute, so is it a blueprint? Is it always dependent on what sort of institution you might work with, whether it's an academic, whether it's a university, whether it's a news outlet or any other?
Well, we have a number of very good tools. In academia, institutional neutrality is one, where in order for academics to be able to express very different worldviews and to have full academic freedom, you ask for the institution to be institutionally neutral, meaning that they need to focus on their core mission and not stray away from their core mission by issuing statements, for example, on foreign policy or social justice or anything else that does not relate to their core mission. The idea is not to be complicit in things that are unconscionable, but it is to protect the institution itself from imposing a worldview on all the academics under it. This concept can be applied in other areas as well. For example, a hospital should not be taken over by religious fanaticism. For example, if you had doctors that refused to perform certain acts based on their worldview or on their religious convictions, it would be terrible if there was no competition. If you could not get a specific treatment because, the belief is that we cannot touch you if you're a man, and there are only women in this department that could treat this particular affection. Or in another completely different scenario, you would have people saying, public hospitals should be only for people who earn less than a certain threshold amount, and if you earn more than this, we cannot treat you. If there's no competition, you're in a life-threatening situation. So you want to build systems where the fundamental duties of the individuals working in an institution is aligned with the core mission of the institutions. That's why we have impartiality as a fundamental duty for judges. It is why we have le serment d'Hippocrate for doctors, so that the hospital could provide care to anyone and everyone, including people that we have really good reasons to object to. That's the kind of things that I'm looking at this from a fundamental duty perspective and from a core mission perspective.
And in practice, so you would be pitching your approach, your methods, your not so much values, but this sort of method to organizations, or the organization says, hey, something is off, we are not happy, or maybe there's a new leadership coming in, or there is some pressure on them to say, hey, things are off. And they would come to you and say, can you advise us? Can you guide us based on the methodology that you have developed?
So we're offering two services completely for free. One is mediation. If you have a crisis today and you need to respond to the crisis because it affects potentially your core mission, we're providing a mediation service completely for free, with our framework in mind that we need to be charitable to every potential worldview, but we need to protect the core mission of the institution. That's one potential avenue in which, in very practical terms, we help institutions, whether that is hospitals or the judiciary, or there was of course academia. But there was one good example where you go to a notary and you want to have something certified to be used in a country that people usually object to. Let's say Russia, or in these days even Israel, and then nobody in the office of the notary wants to work on the file. And that creates a problem between the head notary and his team, because it cannot perform the work because of that. That is a situation where we could provide mediation services without taking a view on the underlying problem. That's one way. The other way is policies and processes. We believe, and I know that it's a very legal way of thinking about this, but we believe that when you have really strong policies and very effective processes, you can get to a better place. So if you have an institutional neutrality policy, it's very easy to oppose top-down or bottom-up pressure to issue statements on the issue of the day. If you have processes that allow you to defend the free expression and the academic freedom of your staff, it's much better than if you have to come up with ad hoc procedures when the issue is appearing. So that is the type of concrete work products that we can offer.
has a lot to do with governance, and governance not just in government, but the governance of organizations and institutions. And just one idea, well, actually two questions. One is, I'll say them in sequence, let you answer one by one. One is, I've sensed a difference between public institutions and private institutions, or at least those, you mentioned the keyword there, competition, because if I think of that story in the US a couple of years ago when, a bakery or some pastry shop or something, when the guy would not do a wedding cake for a gay couple, and he said, well, this is my conscience and I don't want to do that, etc. And is it free expression to refuse a customer based on your worldviews? So in that case, I don't remember what the outcome of that case was, but the point is it's a private shop and you can go to thousands of others to have your order delivered. And again, without going into the merits of it, where that stands ethically. But there's competition and you can have choice. But if I want to go to a notary, well, I can go presumably to another one. But what if there's certain monopoly in an administration, in a government office, where I don't have a choice? They are the only gatekeepers, and if they refuse, I have a problem.
Yeah. So on this issue, I think the way that I look at it is really completely different. One is, indeed, institutions that serve a public mission, for example, health or education or the judiciary, is one set of institutions. And in those institutions, competition is relevant. So for those institutions, I provide the policies and processes, and then I provide the mediation service. Mm-hmm. But for those things where there's no competition, and it's really an all-powerful actor, the way that I would look at it is to really look at the rule of law and promoting through this think tank identity of the 451 Institute a certain resilience view. And so I would try to influence them to adopt certain best practices so that they cannot be captured. And it's very difficult because presumably if they're in power today, they want to capture the institution. But I want to make them aware and sensitive to the fact that by doing so in a certain way, they may expose themselves to the opposite the opposite majority. So that's how I look at it. Of course, it's not the same type of instruments for both types of institutions.
Because there's that risk, and perhaps that risk is an incentive enough for them to try to avoid it. But there comes the question whether it's good faith or bad faith, because they might turn to you just as a box-ticking exercise and say, hey, let's have a seal of approval. He's going to do whatever mediation there is, but ultimately they are bad faith in the sense that they have no desire to improve their processes and systems because maybe they are ideologically captured, or there is an individual or group of individuals who want to serve their own agenda and not the broader idea of the institution.
Of course, they could be bad faith. And the reason, and we identified that problem as well, which is why we want to develop a resilience to politicization barometer, something that would be that we would be able to measure whether an institution is more or less likely to be captured ideologically, whatever the ideology. And so, imagine that we're talking about universities. You would take 15 or 30 universities and you would have metrics. Like, for example, do they have an institutional neutrality policy? How did they deal with protests? How do they deal with pressure top-down from the government? Do they yield or not? How do they deal with demands that are contrary to their core mission? And so you would have a way to a snapshot of but not a ranking, a snapshot, a barometer of whether you're at risk of politicization or ideological capture or not.
Are you aware of such? And again, you're not happy with the word ranking, but at least a barometer. But are you aware of a European equivalent of what they have in the US, the FIRE, which is like fire, but it is a ranking of freedom of expression among US, the largest US colleges.
And I think they do an amazing job. So there are two inspirations for the work of the 451 Institute, at least in academia. Our work is a little bit broader than academia, but in academia, there's the FIRE Foundation, which is amazing at defending free speech, which is how we nurture disagreement in my introduction. And in terms of preempting conflict, there's the Heterodox Academy. Heterodox Academy is promoting viewpoint diversity and institutional neutrality in academia so that there's not going to be echo chambers in academia that would disrupt the core mission of the university. Those two institutions do have rankings or do have some form of measurements that we lack in Europe. In fact, institutional neutrality is not even talked about too much in Europe. And I believe that it's picking up pace in the US, probably for the wrong reasons, because it's a way for the universities today to protect their self-interest in not being attacked anymore. But I don't mind about the motivations of people. If they get to a place where they're more resilient to politicization, I think it's a good place to be in.
It's one thing I wanted to add there where I said we're private versus public or monopolies, but certainly in the private world and the private business, there are a lot of monopolies. So if it's a private monopoly, and I wanted to, that was the second question that I hinted at earlier in the digital space. So if you are a platform, and be that Google or be that OpenAI or whatever technology we're talking about in which domain, but as long as you're not just a dominant player, but you are even more, occasionally tend to abuse your dominant position, to use the legal term, then there is an issue for the clients, for the customers. So how does that play in all of this?
Well, if there's no competition, there's even more incentives to be resilient to politicization. Because the less competition you have, the more severe the consequences if you're ideologically captured. Whether that is from top down, whether from the right or from the left, or bottom up, whether from the right or from the left. If you have a system where you're dominant and you don't have policies and processes to make sure that you're not ideologically captured, the consequences on society could be dramatic. And so I would be even more motivated to go and resolve those type of issues than I am to resolve issues in institutions where there is strong competition. It's interesting because sometimes it's not about all-powerful dominance. Sometimes it's about when you have a hospital that is the only one in 100 miles radius, you really need to be focused on this one, even though theoretically there's lots of competition between hospitals. So that type of matters is just an extra incentive for the foundation to act when there's a bottleneck that is possible and that there's no resilience to politicization.
I really admire that approach. And I think you are, I wouldn't say in an impossible place with this. It's just a very difficult because you have very commendable principles and ways of approaching it. Looking at concrete problems, concrete institutions, and advising them, I think it's an extremely challenging thing. So I'd be very curious to see how it goes and what sort of experiences you have. And unfortunately, we have certain time constraints today. But this is a conversation, I think it's only getting started because there's so much more to discuss, also to hear perhaps in a couple of months. What experiences and what clients, even anonymously, but the kind of patterns and the kind of conversations you will be having with them or partners or those that you advise and draw those conclusions to say, okay, what challenges has this brought up and what sort of ethical, moral dilemmas did you have to face and how did you approach them?
Yeah, we've started that work, even though the foundation is very new. We've started that work because the crises do happen. And so they're facing those crises now. And this is why I believe that there is, I don't like the word market for this, but there's a need for sure. And so it is true that it's going to be difficult to scale. although I'm not too much interested in scaling it dramatically. I'm interested in looking at one institution at a time and one decision at a time, both from a resilience to politicization issue and from a rule of law perspective. And I think if we do that consistently, we may get somewhere. But thank you so much for welcoming me into your podcast. I really appreciate it. And I really enjoyed the quality of the conversation. Thanks to you.
No, I appreciate you saying that. And another big topic, which we very briefly in the intro hinted at with AI, because that's going to be covered in our next conversation. And I already granted that there will be a next conversation, is to look at it, again, not from a technological perspective, but to see how that changes things, because there's a lot to say of its societal impact and what it means, but also the way you solve problems with AI.
Yeah, no, I love to talk about this, and I would love to discuss it with you. The one thing with AI that I think is amazing in the sphere of the conversation that we've been having is stress testing, red teaming, making sure that we can explore vulnerabilities in a way that we've never been able to do at scale before. That is something that I really, really love. And the other thing is truth seeking. With AI, it's incredibly difficult to get ground truth. And so those are the two topics that I'm playing with in terms of AI development and implementation, both in the work of the foundation and the work of my law firm.
Yeah, no, this is extremely interesting. Like you said, these concepts, the very concept of what's a ground truth and how the AI might distort it, but also how we think through problems with AI while knowing where it might mislead us and what are the points where it's actually helpful.
Yes, absolutely.
Those are mentally noted and
Yes.
probably even in some digital form, so we can continue there. But for now, keeping with our tradition, if I could ask you to pull a card and answer that.
So, have you ever traveled on your own? Well, I've traveled on my own for my studies, and it was an amazing experience, but I've never been on vacation by myself. It's something that I might want to try one day, but I'm a very social person and I'm very family oriented. So I don't think that it's in my cards in the next few years or even in my life. I know a lot of people who do that, and they find this really it brings enormous value to them. I think I learned a lot when I studied, and I went off on my own after the beginning of my studies in Belgium. I went to Canada, and it was an amazing experience. But it's a more of a common experience than just traveling on my own.
Yeah, it sounds exciting and amazing, and a lot of people love it, but it's not as straightforward as you might think at first, right?
No, it's true.
That speaks to me. Sir, to be continued.
Thank you so much. Thank you.